It's like, does this work for you? Are we doing it correctly? And they've been so great to let us know when things are not working or how we can do better. And so we're excited to have them here. And it's just a coincidence, but it actually happens to be International Week to celebrate deaf people this week. And the theme for today was putting deaf people on the agenda. So check that box, we got it. But I think it's really important and we're so excited. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Kenz and Aaron. Let them get started.
What button do I push again? Forward. Yep, forward back.
Hello, my name is Erin Watkins. I have been with SWAVO Lily since 2009, and I originally started as a volunteer. A few years later, I became the office manager and have worked my way up since then, and somehow I've become the executive director. And so, like I said, I've been with the agency for 14 or 15 years. And I was born and raised in Fillmore, Utah. I was born deaf. We aren't exactly sure why or what had happened. There's no genetic history of deafness in our family. I did go to Gallaudet University, the only liberal arts college that offers its instruction in sign language in the world. After I graduated, I came back and I started working for SWAVO Lily. I was an advocate for about 10 years. I still feel like I carry the role of an advocate, even though that's not my formal position. You never get away from that. I still feel like advocacy is such an important part of the work and it's in my heart. So that's a little bit about who I am. I'll turn you over to Kenz.
I'm Mackenzie Smith. Most people just call me Kenz. I started working with SWAVO Lily a few years ago as a volunteer. I started off as the Northern Utah advocate and I really enjoyed that, but I really got involved in the organization and now I'm the outreach program coordinator and I love it. I get to meet so many different organizations and many different people from all different backgrounds and I love my job. When I was born, they believed I was deaf when I was born, but I didn't find out until I was closer to 3 years old. I do have a younger sibling who is also deaf. There are 5 of us and the 2 youngest are deaf. I grew up learning in an oral system, so I learned how to speech read and speak, and later I learned to sign. And after high school, I realized that my identity is deaf, and so I started to value and appreciate who I was and started using sign language and being involved in the deaf community more. And I am involved in the LGBTQ organization. I help deaf people in the community in that field as well. Some of you may be wondering about the roots of SWAVO Lily, where our origins are from. I do have that story for you for a little bit later. But kind of the impetus was in 1999, we had oh, we're too far on the slides. So sorry. In 1999, one of our deaf community members, someone who had come from a deaf family, very well known within the deaf community, had found herself in a domestic violent relationship. She, let's see, how do I want to say this? I want to make sure that I make all the connections for you culturally. So she had gone and met with the police and tried to explain about her home environment. She had a lot of documentation. She had a protective order. And they gave her the protective order, but she didn't understand what it was and gave the protective order to her partner. The police did not take the time to explain to her that it was a protection for her. She was unaware of what a protective order even was, and so she gave it to her abuser. And of course, he was very upset. And he just ignored the protective order, entered her home,
A friend was there with her and had escaped out through the kitchen window. As she looked back, she was waiting for her friend and realized that her friend was stuck in the house. And so she knew her friend was in danger. She called the police and then did hear the shot, and the neighbors had called as well. They had the SWAT team come and try to figure out how they were going to get into the home. They had learned about TTY, but of course, the two in the home were not answering the phone. And they heard a second shot, and they went into the home and found them in the bathroom. Both of the individuals were deceased, and that created a wave of grief throughout the deaf community. We realized that domestic violence doesn't happen outside of our community, it happens also within. It was something that really rocked our reality. Luckily, Washington State has a program called ADWAS, AGWAS. They are another victim assault agency in Washington State. They had a grant that they would partner with 5 different states and bring them to Washington State to train, and then those states would go back to their home states and set up a domestic violence agency. So we had a group of deaf people who went and learned about the program, and they set up SWAVO Lily in 2000. So again, that incident happened in 1999, and then we were able to open our organization in 2000. We were finally able to get federal funding in 2007. We still have done a lot of work, and then we've seen our organization grow. We are now a business of 8. We originally started with 5 volunteers. We were all sharing a pager at that time, if you remember pagers, and now we have 9 paid staff employees, and that is really exciting for us. We're really proud of the work that we're doing, and we want to see that continued growth within our organization.
So we started again, this was our first logo in September 2001. And then 10 years later, we changed our logo. And then recently, October 2022, after several years, we were able to create a new idea and came up with this logo. So we wanted to kind of explain a little bit where this came from and the reason behind these logos. So you'll notice that this first one shows a woman, and it's very feminine. And this next one is more on domestic violence, but this third one will explain a little bit about why we chose the logo. But first, we just have some questions for you. Have you ever met a deaf person before? And what has that experience looked like? What did you notice that worked in that interaction and what didn't? And did you learn anything from your interaction? Anyone have any comments?
I don't have a mic thing. No, sorry. Okay. So I worked at the care center and we had a patient who was deaf, but we couldn't understand, so we had to wrote notes back and forth to understand what she needed. But working with her, we took a sign language class so we could work with her more. They actually sponsored it for us too.
That's really good. Thanks for sharing. Does anyone else have any experience working with someone that's deaf? Go ahead.
Well, my neighbor is deaf, and his wife teaches sign language at BYU, and so we communicate with our neighbors regularly, so I'm used to that, the way that he communicates with us. But it was nice that they explained to us up front when we met them the best way to communicate, and that has helped us a lot to know to look at him or to speak slowly or whatever, would make it work. But and then when I recently had a victim that is deaf that I'm working with, and I had you guys come and help me because I was texting with her and I was thinking that I don't think it's translating properly. And so I really appreciated you guys came and helped me work with her and or you kind of taught me how to communicate better with her, and I learned that texting doesn't always translate like we think it's going to. So that's something I learned.
Yeah, I would like to add that too. So we had a victim who was deaf plus had other disabilities, so it was great working with her.
Thanks for sharing, great. Other comments? Okay. Someone in the back?
I remember being in college and there was a sign language instructor and a deaf person having a conversation. I realized this and was about to walk the community and look around them. And they actually stopped me to let me know that they would have preferred if I had just walked with them as opposed to kind of, I don't know, seeing them out. I don't know the best word to describe that. And I was surprised by that. But
Right, it's a lot more distracting if you try to like duck under or do something like that. You just walk through. I mean, it's like just a snapshot and then you're through. So we don't play that doesn't bother us. This is one of my favorite artists, a comic artist, and he is deaf.
I know sometimes it can be awkward for you to work with a deaf person when you know that's not your everyday experience. Sometimes you meet them and you feel a little unsure of how to proceed. This is a story that happened quite some time ago, so I know things are better now, but I went to Wendy's, the restaurant, and I thought, oh, how am I gonna order? So I had been writing my order on paper. The worker across from the register looked like a deer in the headlights. He was so shocked to see me as a deaf person, and it was a little bit funny to me. And so I found I asked, I mimed, can I get some paper? And so he found a piece of paper, and then I thought, well, I need a pen too. And so he looked for a pen, but it was interesting to see him be so shocked and figuring out how to navigate that bit of communication. I want to go ahead and let you read our mission statement right now. It is the mission of Salem Lily Center for the Abused Deaf is to promote a safe and empowered community for deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind people by providing culturally accessible services, advocacy, and education.
I want to add a little bit more about this mission. We want to make sure we're providing access to all organizations, especially interpreters, because you never know when a deaf person may come into your organization. We want to make sure that there's an ASL interpreter available, so that deaf people feel more likely that they can go into the organization and feel they can feel welcome. And so we will make sure that happens. Remember I mentioned before this logo with the 3 petals. We want to make sure that people understand the 3 types of services we provide. We provide direct services to our victims. We provide training for anyone who may interact with deaf people. We will train police, shelters, and different organizations that will interact with them. We also will provide community education, K through 12, middle school, mostly middle school and high school. We'll provide training for the deaf community as well. We want to emphasize the importance of education. As I told you about our impetus story about the woman who passed away in 1999 because of the protective order misunderstanding, we realized that we needed to train the police on the proper way to keep deaf consumers and deaf victims safe when they receive services from the police department. We also recognize that we need to provide education to our own deaf and hard of hearing communities. We've recognized that many of our community members who are born deaf or hard of hearing, 90% of them come from hearing families. Of that 90%, 73% of those families do not know sign language. They do not know anyone in their realm of people that is deaf or knows sign language. So they don't even know
what to look for. These children do not understand what a healthy relationship looks like. They don't understand what is okay and what is not okay because of language deprivation in their home. So we recognize that we do need to provide that education to our community members. We have also presented at universities. I did present one time that there was a man who was sitting in the back. It was Sexual Assault Awareness Month. After the presentation was over, he came up to me and said, "You talked about these different examples of what domestic violence looks like, and I think that it's happening in my own home." I really applaud this person for being able to recognize that he was the one that was doing that to his wife. He didn't even know it. He was unaware that his behavior was inappropriate, and he was willing to receive the education and come and get help.
My passion is educating the youth. Because again, a lot of them grow up and they're, they're sheltered from us. We can't necessarily learn anything. For example, hearing people are able to pick up things vicariously, just being able to hear. But a deaf person relies on sign language and they can't hear what's happening around them. So they miss out on so much communication. And so we try to educate our youth.
So as I said, one of our pedals is direct services, and I want to explain a little bit about what that might look like. If somebody needs to go to a legal appointment, those can often feel very overwhelming, especially the jargon that is in those kinds of environments can feel very overwhelming and intimidating. And so we will provide a victim advocate to go with the victim as a support system so that they have somebody that they can navigate the system with, especially the legal system. That one's quite complex. We also have 2 in-house counselors. We also have a list of several therapists and counselors who know sign language so that these people can get direct services of therapy and counseling through their native language. You might be wondering what a shelter companion is. Often the biggest problem with our deaf community is feeling isolated, and so they will often go back to their perpetrator, back to their home, because there's communication there. And we value communication. When they go into a shelter, they feel isolated and they just think, this is not worth it. I'm going home. It's better at home than it is in the shelter. So often we will have a shelter companion who will go to the shelter, go out for walks or have visits so that that person does not feel so isolated. We also provide ADA support. We want to make sure that the community is understanding their ADA responsibilities. If we have somebody who says they're trying to get access to a certain kind of information or business, we can provide that ADA support. Some of those things might even just include making sure your captions on your TV are on, or that you have an alarm system that is visible through a light, or some people need an alarm where when their baby cries, that it just offers a light that instead of an auditory stimulus is a visual stimulus. And so we help people do that as well.
Yeah, that's her twin sister. That's Erin's twin sister right there on the slide, just in case we're wondering. Okay. So the next pedal is training, and we're doing that today. So we will often go into shelters, like Erin said, and this lady back here commented, and we really enjoy that partnership that we have. We want to provide accessibility services training to different organizations. We train law enforcement, and we do train interpreters as well. Sometimes interpreters, they know sign language, yes, but sometimes they don't know how to approach a traumatic situation, and so we will help them with that. We also will do a lot of training with judges and lawyers and other professional providers, and we will cross-train there to make sure everyone's on the same page.
I'm sure some of you are wondering why we would train interpreters. The problem, or it's not a problem, but it's important to recognize that sign language is very visual, and we don't want to re-traumatize our deaf victims. And so we provide training to interpreters to make sure that they are choosing correct signs. We actually have a book that says the, sign for stuck is this sign on the V on the neck. But then we also have another sign for victim that looks the same. We don't want to send a message to a victim that they are stuck in their abusive environment. So we have changed the sign to be more neutral with this V shaking out in the front. So that's just an example of one of many ways that we're training interpreters, and also so that they're providing trauma informed interpretations. And that's why we provide training to interpreters.
And also, another reason we will try to have interpreters use maybe less words that could be traumatizing. So teaching them to be more aware of the victim and how their words may affect them, and to communicate effectively. I already mentioned community education a little bit. We provide support groups. Ken, do you want to talk about your support group, your LGBTQIA support group? Yeah, so I have a monthly Zoom meeting that I do with anybody that wants to be involved. It's really nice because the deaf community in Utah obviously is very large, and we're rural, but obviously the LGBTQ community is a lot smaller. And so we just had a workshop recently that we hosted, an LGBTQ hangout, and it was suicide awareness. And so we were able to have 2 different social workers join us in this meeting last month. We had someone who was an astrologist, and they talked about providing education, and it was really enjoyable. We really enjoyed it. We do intend to set up a women support group, and also do some art therapy. So there's a few support groups that are on the horizon. And it's not just in Salt Lake. We do have activities here in St. George as well. Next week, we're going to be hosting another workshop for Suicide Awareness Month, and that will be held in Salt Lake City, but we have it in both locations. Anybody have an idea what deaf abuse might look like? Okay, let me ask you this. What do you think are the 2 most valuable, okay, let me back up. Often we know that domestic violence involves pushing or hair pulling. What are the 2 most valuable resources to a deaf person? Somebody have a? Oh, I see somebody. Oh, we got 2 people raising our hand. Okay.
Their hands.
I would say communication devices.
Yeah. You mentioned hands too. Okay, yes, so hands and communication, and then there's a second one. What are the most valuable things to a deaf person?
Eyes.
Yes, exactly, our eyes. Well, the caption is. Abusers often want to cause their victim to be isolated more, because the more independent they are, the more likely they are to be able to escape. So we did have someone who was from a different state who decided to hitchhike simply because they were afraid of losing their eyesight. Their abuser had hit them in the head enough times, they had lost all their residual hearing, and they had started working on their eyes. And so the person thought it was safer to hitchhike to Utah to get help than to be worried about losing their vision. So again, the point of a perpetrator is to isolate their victim and have more control. Often the perpetrator will break their victim's hands so that they can't write and they can't sign.
we have something called a video phone, or sometimes they will take their cell phone, still the charger. They will find various ways to make sure that their victim cannot reach out to other community members.
This one's interesting, refusing to sign in an environment. So one time we sent police to a well check, and the perpetrator was hearing, but they focused on the hearing person. They didn't interact with the deaf person, so that is a form of abuse. And isolation, we talked about that, isolating the deaf person, withholding them from being able to go out into the community to, and, you know, associate with their deaf peers. And so the hearing person will isolate them from that. Also hearing aids, cochlear implants, any other assistive technology they might be using. Even laptops. Anything that they might use for communication, they may withhold that from them.
A lot of times people know that if a victim has their hearing aids, they will have a lot more opportunities to communicate, and so they will destroy those to make sure that there is isolation. And they also know that they're very expensive, so they're not easy to replace.
And it says, that last one says speech, hearing, and signing abilities. Not all people who are hard of hearing or deaf can speak well. And so sometimes they will criticize them for their speech abilities. And so then it makes them more quiet and more isolated because they're embarrassed of the way they speak or talk.
I'll explain a little bit more about that. For example, so Ken's and I are two deaf people. Ken speaks better than me, and if she tells me that and demeans me, it forces me to feel like I must rely on her for speech. Sometimes they'll even say, "You're not deaf enough. You grow up in a program that focuses on speech." And so that's another way that abusers will isolate their victims. And often the victims are unaware. Sometimes you might have somebody come into your organization without hearing aids. It is very possible that their abuser took away their hearing aids. So even if you have them there and they're not wearing them, you should ask a little bit about that. Ask if they have it or if it was what happened. If it's broken, and then you can use that for documentation to enhance your case. So these are a lot of the things that people tend to overlook, so please be aware of those.
One story I'd like to share that happened recently was we came into an organization, and I had known that they've had a lot of situations before where someone had come in and we wanted to be supportive of them. So there was an experience that I had where this person, they had sent the police to their home for a well check. And they brought an interpreter with them. But they only talked to the hearing husband. They didn't ask anything to the deaf person. And the police they contacted us, the deaf person contacted SWAVO Lily and told us what happened. And they were very confused. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't understand the process. And so when we were able to talk with them and sign with them, we realized that the victim, didn't have the access that they needed. They didn't have their cochlear implant. And it had been removed. And we said, "Why do you not have your cochlear implant?" And so we learned later that the perpetrator hit their head very hard and they were not able to use their cochlear implant anymore. And they couldn't get an MRI to see what had happened because of the cochlear implant metal that is installed. The husband was trying to make her look crazy, but really, she just didn't have accessibility and she didn't have sign language. And so when we stepped in, everything became very clear. And the social worker wasn't even aware, because we were able to connect all the pieces together because of our cultural sensitivity. And we were able to have so that way she was able to have full accessibility, which was missing in that case previously. All right, so here's some statistics for you. So studies indicate abuse is 2 to 6 times more likely to happen to someone with a disability. Deaf and hard of hearing is also listed in the disability spectrum, but we don't see ourselves as disabled. 30% of that abuse is 30% of hearing people are abused, but 68% of deaf people are abused. One of the reasons is that is just, is education, the lack of education. And that's one of the reasons why people with disabilities are at higher risk. It is so easy to isolate a deaf person. All you have to do is cut off communication. That's immediate isolation for a deaf person. And the isolation doesn't happen overnight. It's something that happens very incrementally, and sometimes we cannot even be aware of it happening until it's too late. Our deaf culture is means so much to us. It's part of our identity. We actually value being deaf. We are visual people. Our language comes in through our eyes. For example, the sign for tree, we use one hand to show the ground and the other hand to show the trunk, and the fingers represent the branches. It's a very iconic language. And it's something that we value above all else. Deaf community events are our opportunity. It's like our second home. It's where we go, and there's no barriers there. We all are supporting each other, and it's just such a beautiful environment for us. We share our histories and our stories. One example that I have from 2016. Do you guys remember the reality TV show, The Next Top Model? Niall DeMarco, do you remember that contestant? He is hot. And he is a culturally deaf person, and he won. You should have seen the reaction in the deaf community. Absolute elation. And then he became involved with Dancing with the Stars, and we were so excited. There was so much rallying support for him, and to see him win again was absolutely thrilling. We were all so excited. We felt like it was our ability to show the world that we can be out there, we can be winners, and we can dance, and we can do anything. It was such a moment of pride for us. And there was a Netflix TV show that he also produced called Deaf Lady. And it was so cool. So it was so cool to see a deaf DJ on that show. And also there was another mover where we had an Oscar winner. Did you see Coda? You see Coda? Yeah, that one won an Oscar. And it's just thrilling for us. We love an opportunity to show the world that we are capable. There are no limits for us if we're given the opportunity. And we love it when there is somebody that can be loud with their deafness and show the world what we can do. We have norms and values. For example, I'm going to show this to you. See how I touch Ken, physical touch. She looks at me when I touch her on the shoulder. A lot of hearing people do not want to be touched on the shoulder. So if you see us tapping you, it's not that we're trying to breach your bubble. It's such a normal thing for us to get attention. We don't yell, well, some of us do yell maybe, but the cultural norm is to tap on the shoulder to get attention. Also, eye contact is very important to us. We value our eyes and our hands. We've already mentioned this. Those are our sources for language and community connection. Accessibility is, it's just beautiful. Oh, I jumped ahead. Oops, I'm so sorry. Again, we talked about being a visual community. Gestures, eye contact are very important to us.
we've already lost one of our 5 senses, and so our other 4 senses become stronger or become heightened. We are able to visually capture a lot of stuff that the rest of you would miss. For example, I have some coworkers over there chatting. Just kidding. This week, when we were out in the backyard, we were just hanging out in the backyard, and someone saw something move on the side, and we all looked, and there was a scorpion. It was almost like a success to just recognize something that small, that far away.
Yeah, and it was not a black scorpion, it was very clear, but we were able to see it just off on our peripheral vision.
Sometimes those who were visiting last night were a little bit in shock of our St. George scorpions. Language, I mentioned how much we value access and input, and how much we value sharing information. Interpreters are not just for us, interpreters are for you too. It's a two-way street. And again, we love community. We are a close-knit family.
Okay, I'm hard of hearing, but that, you do it.
Oh, there's a question in the back, yeah.
So I was just curious, do you guys have like slang when you talk? Like,
Yes, we have ones like champ, true biz, that. Yeah, what else do you guys got? Which one? This one that's like, oh, cat got your tongue, or wow, that's incredible. Oh, that's awesome. Why are you doing this? 4. I'm giving you an ASL gloss because I don't have great English choices for you. This one on throat is like, oops. We have another one that's literally trained on, which means you're too late to the story. You need to make a list of that.
That's not a question you get on, yeah, we need to make a list of all those slang words we use.
I know that the word should be definition, but I really wanted this to be definition. So, I wanted to explain the capital D. That is an indicator of culturally deaf people versus an auditorily deaf person. Some people prefer to be involved in the deaf community. They use sign language as their primary mode of communication. They typically are the people who will use a capital D. We do have another group of people that identify as hard of hearing. They're not quite as involved with the deaf community. Sometimes those people within the deaf community, or excuse me, the hard of hearing community, they know sign very well, but they have,
Yeah, that was me growing up. I preferred to speak. I didn't use sign language a lot, but then as I learned sign language, I was like, oh, I'm hard of hearing. And it wasn't until I was about 26 where I realized that I really did value the deaf culture and I valued what it stood for. So now I think I have moved myself up to big D deaf. And Erin says, welcome.
I want to bring your attention to the word hearing impaired. That is a very diagnostic word, a medical word. It's something that we kind of cringe about. Hearing impaired is a focus on what we cannot do, our limited function with ears, and focuses only on a broken ear versus who we are as a person. I want you to recognize me as a person who has graduated from college. I'm an executive director of a big organization. I'm married. I have a driver's license. I can do all of these things that have nothing to do with my ability to hear. So that is a term that maybe you can eliminate from your vocabulary. It's a little bit offensive. Maybe adopt one of these other ones.
You'll see older generations use that word a lot more than the younger generation. So the last, so what does deaf gain mean? We're going to talk about that phrase.
Utah has about 500,000 people who have a hearing loss. So 500,000 people in Utah with a hearing loss, that's a pretty big number. Are you shocked by that number? Yeah, and it can vary. The age range is, also that statistic is from 2010.
And a lot of that includes people who become deaf later in their lives.
Yeah, so we do anticipate that that number will go up. But when we talk about people who use sign language as their primary mode of communication, that number is about 5,000, according to the 2010 census. So we want to talk again about deaf gain and what that means. You can't see it right now because the captioning's covering it, but it does say deaf gain. What do you think deaf gain means?
So I have another question.
Go ahead.
So somebody who can speak and hear approaches you, how do you prefer to be approached? Tap on the shoulder?
For me, I can speak and sign.
For me, I can speak and sign. But I prefer sign language. That's my personal decision. Especially if it's one-on-one, I usually can catch what everyone's saying, but if it's in a group situation, I definitely prefer sign language. I just had a meeting with my mom, which I mean, I've known her my whole life. And then a neighbor, and the three of us, we were talking together, and I wanted an interpreter because if they would say something, I'd miss it. I'd be looking at my mom, and then the other person would say something, I'd miss what they were saying. So it just depends on the situation and the person, but I think it's important you always ask them what they prefer.
So if,
Yeah, I agree. Ask.
like, if we're just like, okay, run into you in the hallway and want to be like friendly, just wave,
Oh, yeah.
tap.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just come right up and tap, say hi, gesture. We don't bite.
I do.
We're nice.
I bye.
Yeah, you can do charades. Play the game charades.
You're familiar with that game?
Yeah.
What would you do if you were trying to tell me water? What would you charade for water? Oh, yeah. What would you do if you were hungry? How would you show me that you were hungry? Do charades for hungry. I've seen everybody do it, like rub their tummy. Charades is awesome. I know it feels a little bit silly, but we appreciate that accommodation so much that you are making the effort to talk to us. We don't see it as silly. We are so appreciative.
And a lot of times people will show things on the phone too, and we'll show them sign language. So they'll, if you type out good morning, we'll show you the sign for good morning. And so we're happy to teach you as well. So don't feel embarrassed by that.
So we're talking about deaf gain is the opposite of hearing loss. We are not going to be talking about hearing loss. We are going to be talking about deaf gain. What are we so lucky to have?
I'll tell you one thing, we sleep very peacefully. Last night, when I went to bed, I know they're all laughing. I don't hear anything because everyone's talking and laughing. I didn't hear a thing. And I just went right to sleep. I think they went to bed at midnight and I was just fine. I went right to bed. It was really nice. That was definitely a deaf game.
Yes, and my husband snores bad. I'm fine. It doesn't bother me a bit. It's awesome.
I had a neighbor that was, her children were deaf. Her husband was deaf, she wasn't, and her children were deaf. And I wanted to introduce these up to the children. In our neighborhood. And so as I spoke to children, she kind of taught me how to approach them and what to say, because they were just little and learning. They haven't learned all the sign language yet, and how it made me aware of how much children read body language. We are careful sometimes with our words, but what our body language does could be the exact opposite of what we're trying to say. And so I learned that there were ways to approach those children that didn't seem, scary to them, even though I was saying it's okay, or hi, how are you? They were reading my body language, and if I'm back office, it's more understanding the words I'm saying. So body language plays a big role in when you talk to them.
Yes, it is very important.
For sure. Like I said, we are a visual community. We can pick up on body language that you think you've hidden. Thank you so much for sharing. Another part of Deaf Gain, if you're going on a scuba diving trip, we don't have to worry about what we want to communicate underwater. We can say anything that we want to. Sometimes you need to talk to somebody in the back of the room. I can just sign to somebody in the back of the room without being noisy.
I want to add a little bit more about body language. So body language is just like when you use your voice, like tell me a good example, let me give an example. So I can't hear someone, oh, yes, okay, yes. So if I'm really upset, like when a deaf person's upset, they're going to, their body language will show their intention, you know, the furrowed eyebrow, kind of the, you know, the lean forward shoulders. I mean, you can see when someone is angry or upset. If someone is sad or mad, they're gonna be smiling and being like, hi, I'm mad right now. They're gonna show it, you can see it on their face. Sometimes we have a little bit more expression than most people because of the way we use body language. I just had an experience where I was playing pickleball. And I was in a hearing group. And I did have an interpreter, which was really nice, but the interpreter was late. And so as I was waiting for my interpreter to arrive, I saw the opposing team. They were saying something. I'm like, oh, I can't hear because I take my hearing aid off when I play. And so they were yelling, kind of talking to me, and I'm like, this doesn't work for me. But they kept yelling, and someone spit at me. Oh, they were yelling so much that it spit in my face, and I was really frustrated by that. So when my interpreters show up, I was explaining to them how they were yelling at me, and we were kind of, I mean, my personality is one that I will, you know, I'll just laugh it off, but I mean, you know, the situation that happened recently. Reading lips. I want you to pick one of these 4 options. I know that some of you are sitting far in the back, but try and see if you can guess which for kid, right up on that camera. Try and guess which of these 4 sentences I'm saying. I want you to read my lips and guess. I am not going to use my voice, and the interpreters are not going to say anything for you. And Ken's is monitoring to make sure that I'm messy. Okay, are you ready? So some of you are guessing I love you. Who said that? You're right. All of you, that is what I said, all of you. But I love you. Olive juice. I love juice. All of you. The shape that you see on the lips is the same for all 4 of these sentences. So I have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to weed out what you have said and match it to our conversation. And it's a lot of guessing. Sometimes we might enter into a situation and people say, can you read my lips? And it takes a lot of work and energy, and it's exhausting to read lips. Naturally, we all read a little bit of lips, but trying to match with their gestures and their facial expressions, especially depending on the context and environment, can be very difficult. One word is homophone, like homophones can be very difficult. And this is just an example. Trying to guess what we're saying by using all of these words. All these words are similar. And when you're learning in speech, you're learning the word blue versus the word blue. It's the same homophone. It shows up exactly the same on your lips. Here and here. Here as in I hear, and here as in I'm in this room. Flyer and file have very similar. Flu and like I have the flu, like if you want a plane or I'm sick with the flu. So we have to do a lot of time guessing not only the word, but also the context behind that word.
Many deaf people have a common experience where somebody will say, can you read lips? I would encourage you to recognize that you are setting the tone. You are asking the deaf person to accommodate you when you ask that question. A better question would be, how would you prefer to communicate? Even if they say they can and can read lips, don't depend on that. I think it's important for us to recognize that even when they say yes, it's often in an effort to please you. Victims have experienced oppression so much, they're just trying to please everyone. So they will say yes to you just to try and match you. So please offer that opportunity for you to match them.
Now, my perspective is they don't want to become a burden, like, ooh, they're gonna have to show an interpreter, so they show, if you are very open and saying, hey, how would you like to communicate, and you're proactive in showing, again, that body language of wanting to help, they're not gonna feel like a burden, because if you have to get them an interpreter, that can be a burden, if you show it as a burden.
Waving is a good way to initiate communication, waving and then beckoning them over. You can tap. Deaf people are pretty familiar with physical touch as far as getting attention. You can flash the lights to get attention to the front of the room. I don't love the flashing light because it makes me reminiscent of alarms. Communication in an environment that is free of visual noise that might need an explanation. If you are busy, your hands are moving because you're wiping your mouth or you're eating or you're looking at people outside the door, it's much more calming for a deaf person to have that visual distraction lessened. So an open door is a big one. We are visual people. Anytime somebody walks by out in the hallway, we will notice that. So perhaps you want to either close your door, or if you need it open, move so that your communication is happening wall to wall versus looking out the door. Also, being backlit is very challenging because what happens is you become a silhouette and we can't read the facial expression. So make sure that you are not backlit by windows or lamps.
That example right there, that light from the window, if you stand in front of that window, I would not be able to see you. This was one of my favorites. So one of you sneezes, the interpreter will sneeze, so that I'm involved, so I know what everyone is looking at that moment. So it's equal access, just a simple gesture like that. To know what's going on. As you're having discussion, if somebody is knocking on the door, why don't you just go ahead and say, someone's at the door, hold on just a minute, instead of standing right up and answering the door. If you stand up in the middle of a conversation, that's very disruptive to a deaf person. They don't understand why you have abruptly left the conversation. Or if you have your phone ringing, if you just auto pick it up, that's disturbing. And so if you say, point to your phone and say, oh, phone is ringing, that gives us a cue that we are able to go, oh, there's something else happening in the environment. Talk to me and not to my interpreter. So far, if someone has a question, it's been really great because everyone's been looking at us. They haven't been like, hey, tell them. That is, we're human, we're there, we're here, we can see you. So, you know, when you say tell them to the interpreter, that makes us feel very unrecognized. If you make a mistake, again, just redirect the conversation to the deaf person. It makes it extremely awkward when you don't. And look at me, don't look at the interpreter. Again, that eye contact is extremely important to us.
Sometimes the interpreter will include that in their interpretation. If you say tell her, the interpreter will sign tell her. And so sometimes the hearing person will realize that the interpreter is following exact words. We want them to know that they can speak directly to us. And so if that's not happening, sometimes that's included in the interpretation to help you be more culturally sensitive.
Yeah, if there's something that you aren't sure about, or you don't, if you don't want me to know, don't say it. Don't say it in front of me because my interpreter is going to let me know.
That's their responsibility. They are there to make sure that each person has access to the other person's message.
I mentioned this already. Maybe this deaf person you meet may not know signage, or maybe they only know, maybe they know Mexican sign language. Maybe they only know signs that they've learned from their home environment. Maybe they may not have literacy, they may not know how to read or write. And so if you write with them, it may cause some miscommunication. So, you know, English may not be their first language, so make sure you're accommodating what they need. So Hildegard. Oh, we were doing, she mentioned before about not putting children in a situation with parents this morning in her presentation. And we see that happening a lot in the deaf community. Erin mentioned the Coda movie, right? And who has seen that movie? Who saw the movie Coda? No, you're not included. Okay, there's the people that have seen it. Do you remember the part where the dad went to the doctor and the daughter interpreted his appointment, and he was talking about his itch? You don't know what I'm talking about, you need to see the movie.
You could tell on the daughter's face, she is so disgusted about interpreting about the itch for her dad. And the dad starts talking about his sex life, and she's like, I don't want to know you guys are having sex.
Yeah, he's like, mom has the same problem. She didn't want to know those things. And so it was just an example of how children don't need to know some of the information that's being put in front of them.
The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is for people who have disabilities. Under that act, we are considered individuals with disabilities. This act applies to us, people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. That was passed in 1990, so it's been around for a while.
That was, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about. That was the year I was born. There's a lot of people that still don't know about this, even though that was a long time ago. So if your organization or company, I'm not sure if you don't know what your policies are, you need to contact someone from HR and have them give you that information so you know what you are required to provide.
ADA has a lot of requirements, but one that we want to bring your attention to is provision of American Sign Language interpreters. It is within the law for you to do that.
I learned about providing assistance with paperwork recently. I had an interpreter sitting with me interpreting, and I started to write and I missed what the person was saying. So when someone is writing, a lot of times they will do like a carbon copy and give me those notes. Like if I'm in school, they'll have someone else write those notes for me and then give me the carbon copy, because I can't look down and still get access to the language because of not being able to hear it.
There is, we want to emphasize that sometimes deaf people need more time to complete something, or they may need assistance in completing some of that paperwork. So just know that they need more time. Being able to fill that out completely and thoroughly is a challenge. And so don't try to rush them. You want your paperwork to be solid, and so make sure you're protecting that time for them to fill out their paperwork. Also with shelters, please try and give them an extension if at all possible. It's very common for people in the general community to be able to get at least some kind of employment, but there is a lot of employment discrimination for deaf people. So they aren't able to get a job quite as easily. They're already experiencing so many barriers wherever they go, so many challenges. So please honor that and recognize that those requirements within the shelter might require more time.
I want to give a little bit more information about that extended stay. So a hearing person and a deaf person, sometimes they have. Well, they both are, if they're both in a shelter, so you know, this is just a scenario I want to share with you. And if they both call at the same time, who do you think is going to have first access into a shelter? Don't answer, you can't answer. Who's the first person who's going to get into the shelter when they call at the same time?
The hearing person,
Why? Why do you think that is?
easier to speak to and
Right.
get through paperwork.
The connection, right? So there's one connection line. It's very easy. For the deaf person, they have to call through a video phone. And sometimes it's busy and they have to wait for a second before they can get connected to an interpreter. I waited up to 15 minutes before, so finally they get the interpreter and then they call the shelter and the shelter doesn't know what this is, so they hang up. And so then the deaf person has to say, hey, don't hang up. So the hearing person's already gotten that shelter space spot in the time that it's taken the deaf person to make that connection through the phone. So you have to be patient and make sure that you give them the time they need and make room for them. I want to add an experience when I was an advocate several years ago. I had a woman who had come to the office. She grew up speaking English. She is deaf, but she grew up speaking English. She could not read lips. And she came to me and she was so upset. She said, the police arrested me. I'm the victim. What's going on here? So we worked through some of that, asked some questions. So it turns out that her husband was hearing. The domestic violence had happened. The children were in the room and saw it. The neighbor had called the police, and when the police arrived, the police arrived, and the husband was saying, she is crazy, and was blaming this deaf woman. And he was speaking English, and the police asked her a question, and she said with English, I don't understand what you're saying, I'm deaf. And they said, you're not deaf, you're speaking English, we don't believe you. And so that was a true story that had happened. And she ended up being arrested because of a misunderstanding of what had happened. And that was incredibly traumatizing for her, not only just about the domestic violence, but then not being believed. And so they asked me to be an advocate for them. And I said, well, all right, you tell me how you want to communicate. If the police had asked her that in the moment, they could have avoided a lot of unfortunate fallout from that situation. Will commonly see this happen. One example is I like to try different sports, and I wanted to know if they, provided sign language interpreting, and they said, oh, we know somebody on the team who knows sign language. I'm like, okay, do they know, are they fluent, or, do they know the code of ethics? If they become for example, if someone says, they become a police officer, and they say, oh, we have a police officer that knows sign language. How well do they know sign language? Is it a slow process? Is it frustrating? There can be a lot of misunderstanding if they're not completely fluent. So they have to be certified. They have to pass specific tests relating to their skill set, as well as written tests, testing their knowledge of the ethics involved. So there's a lot of barriers and frustrations that can happen when we have to have someone who is not certified interpret for us. So if you know someone who's really good at sign language, tell them to go get certified. I wanted to add a comment related to how police work with deaf people. Sometimes the police will immediately go to the person that they can talk to. So they often interview the hearing person of the encounter first. And then the deaf person has to wait, or they will ask them to fill out a police report in English, written English. Often the victim is upset because they said, the police didn't even talk to me. So we have contacted the police department
and said, you need to interview this person. But the sad thing is that during the second interview, they're using the backside of the page. So they can't change what they are originally documenting on their first one. And so their voice just isn't being heard. It takes our rights away. Because they can't change the first version of what they said. So they've often asked, can we adapt that? And we said, no, this is part of your record. This is not adaptable. So that's taking away their voice. It's not really equitable at all. It's very unequitable.
I want to talk a little bit about this video clip. Is language universal? Is sign language universal? No. There's a lot of similarities in the gestures, but it is not a universal language. There's Spanish sign language, French sign language, Italian sign language. I mean, pretty much anything you can think of, German. There's all different sign languages. Again, there are some similarities, but it's very widespread and different in its production. There are a lot of people who are deaf from different countries that use different languages, and you can see how beautiful this language is. And so, yeah, we get that question a lot, is if sign language is the same, and it would be very boring if it was all the same.
It's as diverse as spoken language. You have French and Spanish, that's the same. We have American Sign Language, British Sign Language. Ghana, each country has their own sign language, just as each country has their own spoken language.
I kind of talked a little bit about this already, but the reason we prefer certified interpreters are listed up here. Obviously, communication is a two-way street. People who are certified have a national standard that they have to follow. They also are under the Code of Professional Conduct, which is similar to HIPAA. When we ask an interpreter to interpret for us, we will always have certified interpreters because there's names, there's confidential information that is being shared in those meetings. So we want to make sure we're protecting their interests.
If you use an uncertified interpreter, they are not under any kind of confinement to make sure that the victim's information stays protected. So part of the interpreting process, or what happens for the interpreters, they have to take a knowledge test, and they also have to take a performance test where they do sign language and spoken English. So if they pass both of those, the knowledge test is important because that tests their ethics. And then the performance test tests both ASL to English and English to ASL. So again, that's an emphasis that they are here for you, and we really want to tip our hats to the interpreters in our community. They also have guidelines on what is appropriate for their role. We have a question back here in the middle of the room.
When there's been news reports and stuff about interpreters going on, like campaigns or stuff where they're absolutely saying.
Which one?
I've seen several. I've seen several. What is going on there? Are those bad actors, or that they just have a difference? Like, what is going on?
Honestly, I wish I knew, but I know one of the first impactful one was from Africa. I believe it was the funeral of Nelson Mandela, and it was really hurt our community. They're not taking it seriously, that we want access. I'm trying to remember. Was it in Ukraine? Recently, the war with Ukraine, there were a group of deaf people that traveled together. They didn't have an interpreter or anything with them. They relied on each other because there was no interpreter. They were isolated. And so people will pretend to know sign language to just pretend that they're certified, and that really does hurt our community more than it benefits them to be in the spotlight for that moment.
I'm sure you all remember the COVID pandemic. In Utah, the governor spoke about the CDC and what was going on. They had what we call a certified deaf interpreter who was working with our community. What did you think about that certified deaf interpreter who was standing next to the governor. Did any of you see that? Do you remember seeing that? During the COVID news reports? That was awesome for us. We knew everything that you guys knew.
Yeah, there was one question about that. I mean, do you, interpreters make good money? And sometimes people say, do you do it for the money? And whoever the spokesperson is for, they're not the spokesperson for ASL. They don't take that and then just, you know, it's not about them being in the spotlight. Yeah, it doesn't, oh, and see, yeah, some people ask like why someone becomes a certified deaf interpreter. They do it so that they can provide the language equivalents. So it's really important when working with interpreters, it's really important that their position is in a place that we can see them. You were talking about, yeah, I need to be able to see you and the interpreter, so you'll see the interpreters move around in the rooms, but I can see you and the interpreter at the same time. The interpreters will sit in front of me so that they can see me clearly. And then again, if someone wants to speak in another part of the room, the interpreter will move around so that we again have equal access. We can see who's speaking and then we can see the interpreter at the same time. Sometimes I'll sign and the interpreter will be like, oh, slow down so I can catch up to give them time to speak and catch up to what I'm trying to say. And we mentioned before that it's important to focus on the person who's speaking, not on the interpreter, to focus on the deaf person. It's okay to check in and make sure that everything is working with the communication, but you don't need to, you know, talk to the interpreter, oh, do I need to stop? Do I need to slow down? Just keep a good pace and just talk to us normal. Don't yell. That doesn't work. So anything you want to add, Erin? That's great. Good job. You got it all.
We have something called a certified interpreter, and then we also have something called a certified deaf interpreter. The certified deaf interpreter is either deaf or hard of hearing, but they also have the ability to communicate with any variety of deaf person and their language needs. They typically understand cultural nuances. For example, if a deaf person comes from another country that does not know American Sign Language, a CDI or certified deaf interpreter has an innate way of knowing how to create communication with somebody who is lacking in expressive language. They need a lot of training. A hearing interpreter does not have that innate ability. We're going to show you more of how the CDI and hearing interpreter process works. But I want to emphasize that the CDI also has to take a knowledge and a performance test so that they are bound by ethical standards as well. They need to have knowledge and understanding of the deaf community, that capital D deaf, and culture within their knowledge. They must have native American Sign Language production.
The woman who presented this morning, did you just watch, remember they were talking about the 4 different languages with I Love Lucy show? They had the Spanish, the French, the German, and the English, and they had to go back and forth. That is similar to what we experience a lot. So a CDI is kind of a similar experience. One time we had to have a Spanish interpreter too. So someone who was speaking Spanish, and then someone who translated it to English, who then interpreted it to English, who then the CDI took that and then gave it to the deaf person. So we've had something similar in the deaf community too, where you have all of these people who have to be involved in the translation process. And it went through 5 different interpreters. And so I've experienced that. I've seen that before happen. So with my hearing aids, I can hear somebody speak. So sometimes I have to ignore that, but sometimes people will. There was one person who was from Venezuela, and the police was speaking, and then you had an interpreter who then gave that information to a certified deaf interpreter. And so I interjected, I'm like, oh, that's not what he's saying, and so I had to help, because can you imagine if I wasn't there, or if I wasn't able to hear some, that whole communication would have been, it wouldn't have happened, because I was able to hear a little bit more. So it's really important to, make sure everybody's on the same page and that everybody clearly understands each other to make sure that that access is happening. This is how you would set up your room if you're using a CDI. So we've talked about a certified hearing interpreter, and we also have a certified deaf interpreter. We want the deaf consumer to be able to sit with direct access to both the person doing the interview and the deaf interpreter. The hearing interpreter is typically standing behind the deaf person. You can see this chair is moved back behind the victim, so that the victim does not have to see the hearing interpreter's production. They are simply looking at the deaf interpreter. And then the deaf interpreter is looking over the head of the deaf consumer to watch the hearing interpreter. That's how they access the original message. So when the interviewer speaks, the hearing interpreter interprets that into a form of ASL, and then the deaf interpreter takes that message and creates an even more visual and cultural representation for the deaf victim. I encourage you strongly to invest in a CDI. I know it seems like it might take more time, but it is much more efficient, because you have both a hearing and deaf person assessing what is going on, and you're going to have, it might take a little bit longer in the moment, but the efficiency and accuracy is going to be much greater for you. The certified deaf interpreter has ability within their role to make expounding questions, ask clarifying questions that are not within the purview of the hearing interpreter's job. They are not allowed to make those expansions. That is something that the certified deaf interpreter has been trained on recognizing, that it's not part of the hearing interpreter's role. So when you request for an interpreter, you can say, hey, I would like to request as a certified deaf interpreter and an interpreter. And so does that make sense? Sometimes, right now we have 4 interpreters in our room right now. And so sometimes the communication can be longer, but I would definitely recommend you have at least 2 interpreters when you're going to have long meetings, instead of just asking for one. We have a question over here.
So I know interpreters have to switch out. Is that like 2 different things as well?
So usually they'll switch out every 15 to 20 minutes usually. That just gives them a break mentally and physically, because as Aaron mentioned earlier, hearing information, what they're talking about, processing that, and then changing it to ASL. ASL is not English. It doesn't have the same grammar or syntax as English. There are some grammatical structures that are similar, but one example is when you say, I'm going to the store. That is an English phrase. In ASL, they say store, I go. Does that make sense as far as grammar goes? So when we request more than usually 30 minutes, we'll prefer to have 2 interpreters. If we usually try to request a CDI and a hearing interpreter, or we may have 2 hearing interpreters than 1 CDI. So our CDI, we don't have many, but that profession is growing. We have a few interpreter agencies within state of Utah. These are the 3 that we primarily use. Right now, we have interpreters hired through 5-Star. All of the interpreters employed by these agencies are vetted by the organizations and have certification. They know the vocabulary. The ones that we have here today are very versed in the vocabulary. I mentioned earlier, you can check with your HR or anybody who to see if there's any contracts that you may already have with agencies, because some of your organizations may already be in contract with some of these agencies here. But we will provide some contact information, because we are not the ones who contact them, it's your organizations that reach out and contact agencies to hire interpreters.
When you make your original request of an interpreter, make sure you have a lot of information ready that you can give to the agency. For example, the name of your agency, what your agency does, who the contact person is. If you know the victim's name, that's helpful. Once you have set up your interpreter, Utah's Office of Victim Crime, if they have a victim coming in, the secretary will often make the initial request. They'll set it up, and then they will meet with Rochelle. So make sure that when you make this, when the secretary is making the request, they know both the victim's name and whoever is providing the services. If it's your case manager or whatever, make sure that they have that person's name. Also, the name of the secretary, if the interpreter needs to call, and a phone number for the person providing the services. I know that a lot of you will feel uncomfortable giving the name of your clients, because you're concerned about confidentiality. But those agencies are also bound by confidentiality, and when they send those requests out, if an interpreter accepts the job and they see the name and they recognize they have a conflict of interest with that victim, they are able to step out of that and defer that to another interpreter. Make sure you include how long you anticipate the appointment being, what time and the date.
Also, it's really nice to have a brief description of what this appointment is for. So the interpreter, when they show up, they can show up prepared, or that make sure they have the right information, so they know what the topic is, so they have better knowledge to be able to interpret appropriately. UOBC, a lot of them don't know where the building, well, they can find the address of the building, but they don't know exactly where the entry is. So make sure if that's something that is important for the interpreter to find access to the building, you would offer that. Sometimes I will even meet outside the building so that I can get some information that I need beforehand. It's a lot easier if I go into the office and they'll already start talking to me, and it's really awkward because I'm deaf. So sometimes I will wait outside the building for my interpreter so that I can go in and have communication immediately.
Who knows this song? If you do know the manual alphabet, the sign language alphabet, please do use it. Is there any burning questions we have from the audience that you want to know about sign language itself, or anything that you want to ask about our organization, or general questions? We have one in the middle back over here.
Of the interpreters that are here today, like who's the CDI and who's the normal?
Okay, we do not have any CDIs here. Ken's and I both felt comfortable without using a deaf interpreter. We have 4 certified interpreters here, and we're familiar with their work.
Hopefully those two eventually will become CDIs, the two sitting at that table right there. They're very skilled with sign language and English. They're both shaking their heads no, but she's like, I'm saying not now, eventually, someday.
We hope they do. Oh, we got 2, let's go to the back corner where Ben is.
Yeah, can we go back to that diagram of the interview and how you guys have it set up?
Of course. This one?
Just like to explain how like it would work in that like specific way.
Okay, if I am, Erin's gonna be the CDI. Tiffany's the police officer. I'm Tiffany. Erin's the CDI. Andrea is the hearing interpreter and Ken's is the victim. So Erin is interviewing Ken's. Ken's is watching the interviewer. The interviewer is looking at the hearing interpreter across the way. And I am am I the hearing interpreter? Am I the hearing interpreter? I'm the interviewer. Oh, I'm sorry, Tiffany is the interviewer. Erin is the CDI. So I'm going as a hearing person, gonna ask Ken's a question. What day was the incident of your accident?
Nineteen ninety-six.
Oh, okay, 1996. So that was a while ago. Does that help you understand a little bit more how that process looks? So if I know Spanish and none of the other interpreters know Spanish, we would need to have another person come in, and if it's a Mexican Sign Language, then we would also need to have somebody who could work in that language as well.
Where would that person?
Would most likely be sitting with Erin as the CDI, or with the, yeah. Typically, we're trying to just keep one CDI so that we're not dealing with more than one language. So if we needed a spoken Spanish language interpreter, they would sit next to the interviewer.
Whoa.
So we're just navigating. I think the spoken, anything that is spoken Spanish language would sit next to the interviewer. Wait, say again. So what you really would want to make sure is that your CDI has knowledge of this Spanish language. So if you have somebody who's immigrated from France, you don't want to have a Spanish interpreter. You want somebody who is familiar with whatever your source language is. So you want to make sure that those cultures align. The CDI, the certified deaf interpreter, should be aware of what kind of language need is coming from your victim, so that those kinds of languages match. So if you had a spoken Spanish interpreter, they would stand behind the CDI and the interviewer. So sometimes you have a trilingual interpreter that knows how to manage all of the spoken languages, Spanish and English. And we have a question in the back.
Oh, I did have one. I'm a big language nerd, so I was thinking about this earlier. I know that, a lot of times when people learn a second language as an adult, they have limitations with it. So I'm wondering, I know you have a lot of people that grow up with using kind of informal sign language within the household. So I'm wondering if you have, the issue of people later learning ASL and having communication limitations with them as an adult, or is it different?
No, not all. We've actually had a lot of clients, like for example, in St. George, if you look to the St. George website, I think it's DHHS website, is that what you're talking about, DHHS? Yes, Southern Utah's Deaf Center, they have a website there, but we can answer your question a little bit more if people want. If there is a deaf person who's grown up mostly using English as their mode of communication, sometimes often what happens is they will meet somebody who has sign language and will be instantly attracted to them. It happens often as adults, just as Ken's talked about her own experience. She learned in spoken English and learned to lip read, but it wasn't until she was 15 that she was first introduced to ASL and then has actually adopted that as her identity. And my experience has been very similar.
Yeah, I wanted to learn it. It's so beautiful, I know. You're jealous of our language, aren't you? That's so beautiful.
Thank you so much for showing us, because now I know I've been doing it wrong. Of placing the chairs, and I think it makes sense to me now, because I was trying to talk to the victim, looking at her, and now I think that the interpreter should have been behind me, so that she could look at both of us. Wouldn't that be right? So thank you so much for actually showing us, and now I can do better.
At the same time, remember, it's up to the victim to, if the victim prefers the interpreter right here or in a different spot, that's fine. So it depends on the situation, but most common, yes, is they're gonna be behind you.
I'm so sorry if I missed this, but I just, wanted some clarification on why the CDI and the interpreter are both necessary. I understand the reason for the CDI, but just both of them.
So the CDI is a certified deaf interpreter. And the hearing interpreter has limits to how much they are allowed to expound on their understanding of the question or of the information. So the CDI has their certification allows more expansion, more questioning, more digging to the root of what it is that is being said, and they often understand the person who has language deprivation a little bit more than the hearing interpreter does. Sorry, we're missing some information. Okay, so I want to back up and explain this a little bit better. Do you remember the statistic we gave at the beginning that 90% of deaf children have parents that do not know sign language? We call that language deprivation because they are in a home environment where no one is signing. They aren't getting constant exposure to language. Often it is pointing or gesturing. So they are not getting a language at home. So we call that language deprivation. They're often guessing. Parents are just showing them things of what they are. If the kid's pointing at something, that the parent is just showing them this. So there is no language. So unfortunately, these children grow up into adults and they do not have proficient language. So the purpose of a CDI is for those adults who have grown out without language, they have an ability to express themselves in a way that would be natural to them, and the CDI can then change it to American Sign Language, which the hearing interpreter can use to create an English sentence. So the sad truth of deaf experience is that they are often literacy deficient. I didn't start reading until I was about 10 years old. That's when I started reading. I didn't, most of you are learning in kindergarten. I didn't learn until I was 10. So there's just a lot of language pieces to this, and that's why we bring in the certified deaf interpreter, because they have more natural ability to understand what needs to be shown or gestured or expounded on than the hearing interpreter knows. And that is also part of their training and their role in their certification process. So they can expound more. Whereas the certified hearing interpreter is limited to only what was in the original message. Does that help?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is about how much, or if there's any advancements that you guys have seen as far as Lily utilizing, or the deaf community in general, AI, and even the examples that we had a day earlier with, auditory interpretation. Some of those mistakes that Google made 6 months ago are not there, and in a year, 2 years, they're gonna be better than what we even have. I've even been with certified interpreters, where they've gotten it wrong, and so AI will be more accurate and can take into context and cultural innuendo. So I'm just wondering, with the visuals, and how AI can generate that, what are the advancements that have been made, or is there any, or you've seen that, or is it too soon?
No, I don't think that's gonna happen with AI. You're gonna see them make mistakes right here. The captioning, when you look at it all the time, sometimes they'll say things and it won't come up correctly on the captioning. So AI captioning is not always correct.
Is it AI happening now?
Also, YouTube has auto-generated captioning. Yes, this is AI captioning right now. Yeah,
No one is over here typing this. This is just happening auto-generated.
yeah, so this is auto-generated. That is also what is happening on YouTube often, is auto-generated captions. Sometimes I'll be reading it and I'll be like, what is going on? Or I'll see a single word within the correct sentence and the single word will be wrong and my brain will be like, what's that word supposed to be? So I feel like personal interaction with me and the interpreter that we have right now is more accurate for me, and that's what I want to have, because I feel like it's more holistic. It's not just what I sign, but it's the vibes and the energy, the body language, empathy. There's so much involved in communication that AI cannot accommodate. And again, we are visual people. We want that visual connection. AI can't be visual. It's an auto disconnect from the human experience.
So that reminds me,
We might have a question in the back.
Yeah, when, you know, we're talking with our voices, sometimes people talk over each other. How do you guys talk over each other? That's not good.
so sign over each other. We sign over each other all the time, just like there's overlap in voice, there's also overlap in sign language. I wanted to. They were gonna make a comment there, hold on.
And to start to get this
And then
and as for the providers, it's not time. And the pain is free, and so not being able to provide that compassion, and not ability to do that, that may be useful, and that possibly will be like that. With ability, with people, and glory, but one thing that is that one, and something that one.
And I can think of two technologies that are available now. One is video remote interpreting. It's called VRI. Sometimes when a deaf person will go into the hospital, sometimes it might be something really short and until the interpreter shows up, sometimes it can take a while. But when they use a video, it's oftentimes the connection is not great, or sometimes they can't hear and they can't see what's happening in the room. They make mistakes often because they can't see what's going on in the room. So a video remote interpreter is nice for as a temporary solution until a live interpreter can show up. So that's one example of technology.
I agree with that. When we talk about metropolitan areas, we have more resources, but when we're talking about these rural communities, sometimes video remote interpreter is the only choice. So if that is your only choice because of rural situations, please use it. But St. George and Provo and Salt Lake are much more metropolitan areas where you do have resources of an interpreter. We would much rather have a live body with us that can create that connection. Those expressions are much more empathetic to us. We have no excuse in these metropolitan areas, but I do understand that there needs to be exceptions in rural communities.
Especially when it's ahead of time. I know that rural communities again are the exception, but when you know ahead of time, you can definitely plan on getting an interpreter, planning for that.
I'm going to add, this is Anna, I want to add two things. Number one, I want to respond to the original question of AI. Oh, not AI. I just want to say it's never too late for you as adults to learn sign language. You can. I have seen it. I have seen people do it. I have seen adults become experts in sign language. The other thing I want to add is related to the idea of expansion. At universities or things like this, where there is somebody who is giving a platform presentation where the voice delivery is much more monotone. Have you experienced that? That is the same experience we get with AI. It is a very monotone delivery. It is not fun to listen to. We don't get any of the humor. We don't get any of the language. We don't get any of the expression. So for us, AI is robotic. It's an absolute disconnect for us. We have no idea if there is an emotion to this. Is there sarcasm to this? Are you being serious? Is this a joke? We have no way to access that. So that's why we would always choose to have a live interpreter whenever possible.
Yeah, while she was commenting, I was thinking, oh, she's saying with AI, can you marry AI? Oh, there was a joke behind this. When we were talking, I was saying, oh, could you marry AI? And I'm like, no. So if you are AI.
Sometimes we will say something to each other where we're like, I'm gonna sign this to you, but I only want it between the two of us. But if I only want it between the two of us and AI is there, the AI is still gonna say it, even though I meant it to be a discreet conversation.
One other technology that I really do not like, and a lot of people have, you know, added this on Facebook. Sometimes you'll see on social media, you'll see the ASL glove and people are like, oh, that's so great. Look at this ASL glove. Have you guys seen that at all? It is terrible. It does not help you learn sign language at all. It doesn't benefit the deaf community in the slightest.
So when we were talking about social sensitivity, I talk a lot with my hands. Would that be like having to try to not talk with hands when having sensitivity? With someone who is part of caring for them.
Yeah, it depends on the situation.
Do you mean like you talk with your hands you're not really gesturing, but you might be showing signs, or you just might be moving your hands a lot?
I can move my hands a lot when I'm talking, so it's like.
Yeah, it can be distracting, but I've seen you, I know you, I don't see a lot of visual noise there, no. But just try to keep it to a door, but yeah, you be you, I don't see you doing that too much, no. You're doing great. Thank you for being aware of that though, and being sensitive to our cultural needs, I appreciate that.
So I met this lady.
So I love your mom.
Anyway, I met this lady she was deaf, and I am a huge hand gesture person, and she goes, oh, do you know sign language? And I'm like, no, I don't know what I'm doing here, but no, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I see my friends, they gesture a lot, and that's okay. I mean, I don't know, so but people do use their hands a lot, and that's okay.
I don't think I asked my question maybe or clearly. Or maybe it was answered partially, but I guess more my thought was, are you guys aware of, or maybe because of what the feedback been here, that maybe the deaf community in general is less inclined to utilize AI, but are you aware of current partnerships where they're trying to use AI to provide services or extend or try to fill gaps that, like, where they're working with the deaf community? Because some of the things about, I mean, they're moving fast enough to generate actual, imitations of people. So, and there's talk about, how much AI is able to express empathy and making connections and even feeding loneliness gaps and mental health. So I was wondering, are there advances in this arena, or is it more, it sounds like maybe more, maybe not, because people are, it's not something that is wanted.
We're trying to find out where the, no comment in the back. So Erin says, actually, I don't really know, to be honest with you, I feel a lot of fear about thinking about AI doing those kinds of things. I consider it a form of oppression. There's no connection to the human body. There's no ability to create information. It's, I just feel like that would be a step backwards for us. So it's very frightening for me to think about. I just like put me in a light comforter.
Yeah, I feel like that's, if AI becomes a thing, I am isolating myself for sure. Does that answer your question?
We do have one other question in the corner over here. Oh, no, I think our time is almost up.
This is my favorite quote. So during COVID, I have a story, but during COVID, it was a really big challenge. I know it's hard for all of us. We had to wear masks a lot. We were, we had to gesture. It was covering our faces. It was covering people's faces, and we couldn't see people's facial expressions. I went to Jamba Juice, and I had my phone, and I was getting ready to show them my order. And someone tapped me on the shoulder, and they said, "Oh, are you deaf?" And they signed a little bit, and I was like, "Yes." I'm like, "Do you know sign?" I'm like, "Yes, I do know sign." And they said, I was learning in high school, so it was so great. And so they helped me order the Jamba Juice. So I told them what I wanted. And I would often go there a lot because I knew that that person knew sign language. So I would, even if it was out of my way, I would still go there. So we have to think about that sometimes. For a deaf person, you have to think about what resources you have to provide them to make things easier, to make them feel that connection, and to make them feel like you care about them, to give them accessibility. I think it's really important to consider that.
Have you seen the movie Field of Dreams? Do you remember that movie from quite some time ago? They built the baseball field and it says, if you build it, they will come. If your agency builds deaf accessibility, they will come. They will be your clients and they will be comfortable being with you.
So you provide accessibility, we will come. It's as simple as that.
Shameless advertising time. We have a gala coming up. We have interpreters there. This is for a great cause. We would love to have you come. We will have performances. The theme is Under the Sea. We have so many cool things planned. Nicole has done a lot of our planning committee. We have silent auction, live auction, gift baskets. It's going to be so much fun. We have someone from where? What's her name? One person came and saw our live auction and was so excited. They're coming, they're supporting us. We would love for you to be there to support us. We hope you can make it. Here is our contact information.
So Anna is over there, me, Kim's, got Nicole. Tim is our newest hire. So these are those you can contact in our agency. And these are our counselors, our in-house counselors. We have Luba and Kathleen. Both of them are mental health counselors in our organization. Thank you. Thank you all. Oh. More questions? Oh, contact line, okay. So let's turn off our captions so you can get everybody's information. Or move it over. Oh, there we go.
You're the one.
Thank you.
The next one is the side piece of information.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Wonderful information, fantastic partner. We really appreciate everything you do and you're making it our friends. Thank you. All right, we will take a break for lunch. We've got a little bit longer of a break.